The damp, chilly June morning of 2005 began with an unusual movement along the banks of the Mississippi River. 6 Missouri State Police cars, sirens off, quietly pulled up in front of a modest 2-story wooden house on Birch Hollow Road, Hannibal. Neighbors peeked through curtains, watching the officers in bulletproof vests move methodically around the area, the soft crackle of radios echoing in the mist. Inside, Charles Delmont, 79 years old, was brewing his morning cup of tea, a habit he had maintained for decades as a respected retired anesthetist, model father, and exemplary citizen. The knock at the door came at 7:18 a.m. Charles Delmont, Missouri State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance of Eleanor Dawson, 1955. The officers later recounted the old man's hands trembled slightly as he set down the teapot, but his eyes were unusually calm, as if he had known, sooner or later, the past would come knocking. On the night of June 14, 1955, the town of Hannibal, Missouri, lay still beside the dark Mississippi, heavy as a damp blanket draped over the neighborhood. In the small 2-story house at the end of Birch Hollow Street, light from the kitchen spilled out through thin curtains, a weak yellow glow in the summer heat. Inside, Eleanor Dawson, 31 years old, a nurse at Hannibal Regional Hospital, was arguing with her husband. Charles Dawson, an anesthetist respected by colleagues, but known for being rigid and irritable. The words grew sharper with each exchange, the sound of shattering glassware, then silence. The neighbor, Mrs. Mildred Hartley, who lived 2 houses away, heard the front door slam so hard it rattled the walls, followed by the metallic clink of something hitting the floor, then everything sank into silence. That night, no wind blew. The lights in the Dawson house stayed on all night, the living room radio broadcasting a late-night news bulletin plagued by static, the music and interference blending into strange whispers. No one saw Ellie leave the house. No car started. No footsteps. No shadows passing on the oak-shaded road leading to the river dock. Only one light from the ground floor window still shone until the sky began to lighten. The next morning at 7 o'clock, Hannibal Regional Hospital noticed Ellie was absent from her shift. This immediately raised alarm. She had never missed a single day in 8 years of work. A head nurse called the Dawson house, but no one answered. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hartley went over to knock and check, but there was no response. The house was shut tight, only the faint radio still playing, and a cold cup of coffee left on the dining table by the window. By 9 a.m., Charles Dawson stepped out onto the porch, looking exhausted, his shirt rumpled, eyes ringed with dark circles. He went straight to the living room phone and dialed the Hannibal police. The call was logged in the duty book. 9:02 a.m. Charles Dawson, reporting wife missing. Left the house overnight, has not returned. His voice was even, slightly shaky, speaking slowly. She went out last night after we argued, said she needed some air. I slept in the living room. When I woke up, she wasn't here. The duty officer asked, "Do you know where she might have gone?" Charles paused for a moment, then replied, "No. She didn't take the car, her purse or a coat, just said she needed some quiet." The duty officer added at the bottom of the page, "No sign of departure." Outside, the bells of St. John's Church had just stopped tolling, the final echoes lingering in the muggy air as the black Hannibal police car rolled into Birch Hollow Street. Harold Kemp, the town sheriff, had received the report of the missing woman at 9 a.m., and now he was at the scene less than 10 minutes later. The street was eerily quiet. The wooden houses receded into the shadows of oak trees, with only one kitchen light still on in the house at the end of the street, its weary yellow glow filtering through the curtains. Charles Dawson stood on the porch when they arrived, his shoulders trembling slightly under the wrinkled shirt. He said nothing until Kemp spoke. "Are you Charles Dawson?" "Yes. My wife is missing." His voice was dry, like someone who had been awake all night. The door opened, and the smell of disinfectant and a faint ether odor wafted out immediately, a scent Kemp knew from field hospitals during the war. In the kitchen, the ceiling light cast a cold yellow glow over everything, an empty dining table, a half-finished cup of coffee, the steam dried into a brown ring on the saucer. On the chair beside it, Ellie's coat was neatly folded. Kemp stepped across the wooden floor, his shoes making a faint sound in the too-quiet house. He noted no signs of a struggle, but everything was unnaturally tidy. The sink gleamed clean, the floor freshly mopped, and the back door was ajar, letting in the river's damp breeze and the cold, earthy smell. He lightly touched the wall clock, the minute hand stuck at 10:17. "Power outage last night?" one officer asked. Charles shook his head slightly. "No, probably a weak battery." The police spread out through the house. In the living room, the radio was still playing light music, a repeating tune, fuzzy and distant like an echo from a dream. Kemp passed by and turned it off. The silence that followed made the space feel even thicker. He opened the garage door. Ellie's green Ford sat there, the dashboard lights flickering faintly, the keys tossed on the table by the back door. Inside the car, the chemical smell was stronger than in the kitchen. "Tell me again." Kemp turned back to Charles. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" "Around 10 o'clock. She said she needed to go out to calm down, then left. I slept in the living room. Did you hear a car start?" "No. I thought she walked." Charles spoke without meeting his eyes. He kept his voice steady, but his hand kept touching his pants pocket, where Kemp glimpsed a small white cloth protruding. When asked, Charles said it was just a handkerchief. The police said nothing more. They continued searching the kitchen and spotted something glinting under the table in a shaft of sunlight. Kemp bent down and picked it up, a glass vial cap, faintly etched with Park Davis Co., the brand of medical ether. Nearby, on the kitchen floor, lay a small glass syringe, old and worn, its needle tip slightly bent. Kemp placed both items on the table, looking at the man before him. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Dawson?" I'm an anesthetist," Charles replied, almost in a whisper. "Then you must know what ether does, right?" Charles pursed his lips. "I brought some home to disinfect. She must have dropped it." No one said more. Only the sound of the young officer's pen scratching a few quick lines on a notepad propped on the refrigerator. Kemp stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep breath. Hannibal's sky still hung heavy with the smell of river water, gray as lead. He looked back at the house. Back door open, kitchen light on, radio silent. Inside, the husband sat motionless at the dining table, hands clasped, eyes vacant. When Kemp's watch read 9:32, he said quietly to the accompanying officer, "Call for backup." "I don't think she just went for a walk." In the living room, the wall phone still dangled off the hook, its cord twisted from the first call. The call Charles Dawson had made less than 30 minutes earlier, reporting to the police that his wife had left the house in the middle of the night and not returned. When Sheriff Harold Kemp stepped back into the garage behind the Dawson house, the dim late-morning light fell on the dark green paint of the 1953 Ford Custom Line. The car sat motionless like a foreign object, stranded in space, unnaturally clean, reflecting his own shadow on its surface. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, as if someone had hastily wiped it down and forgotten to close it. The keys still lay on the small table, right by the back door, next to the cold cup of coffee he had seen earlier. Kemp bent down, reaching under the seat. Immediately, the chemical smell hit him sharply, cloying, sweet, and cold, like in an operating room. He had smelled it while serving in Army Medical Corps in Korea, and he knew it couldn't be mistaken. Ether, or a similar solvent used for anesthesia. "Reed, come here," he called to the young officer jotting notes on the porch. Reed stepped in, frowning as the odor assaulted him. "God Almighty," Reed said. "Did he wash the inside of the car with this stuff too?" Kemp didn't answer. He gently lifted the rubber mat under the driver's seat floor. Beneath it were darker stains, circular, like liquid that had soaked in and dried. The seat leather was still tacky, gleaming as if freshly scrubbed with gasoline or alcohol. In the corner of the mat, Kemp found a few beige fabric fibers stuck there, possibly from the uniform dress Ellie often wore to work. He carefully placed them in a small envelope, noting it with pencil. "Smell that?" he asked Reed. "Yeah, hospital smell, like anesthetic. More than that, river water too." Kemp pointed to the rear wheel. Well, under the chassis, clumps of brown mud still clung to the metal frame, speckled with fine gray-black sand. He wiped it lightly with his finger, feeling dampness even though the sun had been up since early morning. "This isn't mud from Hannibal streets," he said softly. "This is riverbank mud, the sticky, cold kind only found on the Mississippi shore." Reed nodded, saying nothing. As Kemp stood up, he noticed the back garage door ajar. Beyond it, a dirt yard leading to a narrow path sloping down to the old river dock, where locals sometimes fished. He pictured the night before, the man driving out from here, stopping somewhere along the riverbank, then returning in the dead of night. The car was now so clean, it reflected the sunlight, but the undercarriage wasn't. No one washes the undercarriage for a routine dusting. Just then, Mrs. Mildred Hartley, the neighbor across the street, came over. She wore a floral housecoat, holding an apron still dusted with flour. "Sheriff," she called, "do you want me to tell you what I heard last night?" Kemp turned, nodding. She recounted, around 3 a.m., woken by her cat meowing. She looked out the window and saw a flashlight beam in the Dawson yard. Charles was there, bent over the car, his white shirt soaked. She thought he was cleaning because of rain, but she heard no water running. She only saw him open the trunk, then hose down the wheels in silence. When she looked closer, Charles turned off the light and backed the car into the garage. "Not long after," she said, "I saw him standing at the back door again, looking toward the river." Kemp thanked her and turned to Reed. 3 a.m., washing the car without lights, he said quietly. "You know who does that? Someone with something to hide." Reed glanced at the car, his eyes flickering with unease. Kemp instructed them to bring a clean glass jar and scrape a sample of the mud from under the chassis. He jotted a quick note: "Mud sample origin unknown, contains river silt." But instead of adding observations, he pocketed the notebook. Years on the job had taught him that, without a body, all notes were easily dismissed as speculation. He returned to the main house, where Charles still sat in the dining room, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the wooden table. "We're impounding your car for examination," Kemp said. Charles looked up, voice low. "If you need to, go ahead. I'm not hiding anything. We know, but no one washes their car at 3 a.m. without turning on the lights." A long silence stretched, then Charles replied, almost exhaling, "I just couldn't sleep. I washed the car to take my mind off things." Kemp looked straight into his eyes. There was no grief in that gaze, only tense restraint, like fear of revealing something. He didn't argue further. 2 officers began documenting the scene, photographing the car, garage floor, back door, and the dirt path leading to the river. The noon sun filtered through the tin roof, illuminating the damp, stained car mat and the dark brown river mud streaks. As they left the yard, Kemp paused, looking around. Cicadas buzzed from the distant marsh, mingling with the distant whistle of a towboat on the Mississippi. He knew if something had truly happened to Ellie Dawson, the answer might lie somewhere in that silent mud. He stepped onto the road, closed his notebook, and said quietly to Reed, "Now we know this isn't just a wife out for a nighttime stroll anymore." And as they left Birch Hollow, the green Ford remained in the garage, its glossy paint reflecting the midday sun, suspiciously clean, as if someone had tried to wash away every trace of a night Hannibal would never forget. That afternoon, thick clouds hung low over Hannibal's sky, river mist rising from the Mississippi, making the air suffocatingly sticky. Sheriff Harold Kemp returned to the Dawson house with 2 search team members. He wanted to check the yard behind the garage again, the strip of wild grass stretching to the fence, where the dirt path led down to the river's edge. The chemical smell from earlier still lingered in the air. A hot gust carried the sharp scent of earth and freshly trampled grass. When an officer parted the dry grass near an oak root, sunlight glinted off something glass. Kemp approached, knelt, and lifted it by the edge of his coat. It was a small medicine bottle, label intact. Park Davis ether. Inside remained a bit of clear liquid, the metal cap slightly rusted. He turned the bottom over, seeing a layer of fine soil mixed with sand, the same kind he had found clinging under the Ford's chassis that morning. The bottle had been tossed carelessly behind the fence, less than 3 meters from the house, as if someone thought hiding it under the grass would suffice. "What do you think?" Reed asked. Kemp turned the bottle lightly in his hand, watching the light refract through the glass. "I think someone wanted to wash away this smell, but forgot it clings longer than they imagined." On the way back to the garage, Kemp spotted a dark smear trailing from the back door to the car mat. As he bent down, the streak gleamed reddish-brown in the slanting light. He touched it with his fingertip, the surface dry, but the metallic tang still sharp. He dabbed it lightly with a white tissue. A faint red bloomed immediately. "Not wine," he said softly, "and not paint." They took the sample back to the Hannibal station. In the small lab, the veteran police technician used the only method available then, phenolphthalein solution and hydrogen peroxide. Within seconds, the tissue turned deep pink. "Human blood," he said, "but I can't say whose." DNA technology didn't exist in the world of 1955. Only blood type could be determined. The results came back from the St. Louis lab 3 days later, type O. Not very meaningful, as it was the most common type. But for Kemp, what mattered was that it matched Ellie's medical records provided by the hospital. Around the same time, St. Louis also reported on the glass bottle. The liquid sample inside was pure medical ether, the same type used in Hannibal Regional Hospital's operating rooms. The label, bottle style, and even the production batch code matched the shipment received in May, just 1 month before Ellie's disappearance. On Wednesday afternoon, when Kemp received the sealed bottle back, he sat motionless for a long time in his small office, the bottle on the desk, afternoon sunlight filtering through to make the remaining liquid glow faintly. From the window, he saw Hannibal's daily rhythm unchanged. Kids on bikes, the newsboy calling out, a distant train whistle. No one knew that in the house at the end of the street, the hospital chemical smell and dried blood were telling a different story. That evening, he returned to the scene alone. In the darkness, his flashlight beam swept the garage wall, making the faded paint gleam like metal. Kemp knelt again, where he had found the blood stain, this time touching the concrete floor with bare hands. It felt rough, dry, and unusually cold. He looked around, reconstructing the sequence: an argument, the wife unconscious, the husband in panic, then cleaning, scrubbing, trying to erase the scent of guilt with the very chemical he used daily. An owl's hoot echoed from the riverbank, startling Kemp. He stood, turned off the flashlight, and peered through the ajar back door. There, far off, the water's surface shimmered in the moonlight. The narrow dirt path leading down still bore old tire tracks his team hadn't photographed yet. The path was tight, flanked by reeds, where river mud would stick to the undercarriage, as he had seen that morning. Kemp had no solid proof, no body, no witnesses. But the scattered details were starting to form a picture. The ether smell, the car washed in the dead of night, the blood smear, the carelessly discarded medical bottle behind the house. An anesthetist husband, a wife vanished without a trace. The combination couldn't be mere coincidence. That night, he stood for a long time before the silent house. The kitchen still spilled yellow light, though no one was inside. In the air, the ether smell had faded, but something more haunting, the scent of secrets, refused to dissipate. 2 days after finding the ether bottle in the Dawson backyard, Sheriff Harold Kemp decided to take a step he knew would make things more serious, checking the drug records at Hannibal Regional Hospital. If something was truly hidden behind this disappearance, it had to start where Charles Dawson worked, where ether, morphine, and anesthetics weren't just tools, but power in the hands of someone who knew how to wield them. That morning, Kemp drove to the hospital. The red brick building sat on a hill, its glass doors reflecting the early summer sun. He was escorted to the administrative office by a young secretary, then met the pharmacy manager, Dr. James Halford, a balding, slight man with a soft but precise voice. Kemp opened his leather folder, pulling out a notepad. "I need to see this June's drug inventory ledger, especially the anesthetics." Halford frowned slightly, but didn't ask why. He opened the steel cabinet and pulled out a thick ledger, cover labeled Surgical Supply Record, 1955. Handwritten lines in blue ink filled the pages: ether, chloroform, morphine sulfate, sodium pentothal. Each vial, each bottle noted with date issued, recipient, purpose of use. Kemp ran his finger down the date column to the week of June 14th. 2 lines were faintly crossed out in pencil, then recopied below. Ether, 2 bottles morphine sulfate, 1 box 10 ampules, signed, Charles Dawson. "Is Mr. Dawson still employed here?" Kemp asked. "Yes," Halford replied. "He's on shift in OR2 this afternoon. Always careful, meticulous, never any drug shortages." "Does he usually take drugs home?" Halford started slightly. "No one is permitted to do that, except for disinfecting small instruments or emergency first aid. But even then, it must be reported to me. And this time, no authorization at all." Kemp stared at the signature, slanted, decisive script, the D larger and descending lower than the rest, like the hand of someone practiced, unafraid of scrutiny. He photographed it with the small camera he carried, then closed the ledger, requesting a copy. In the hallway, on his way out, he encountered a woman pushing a supply cart, her hair tied high, dark eyes. When Charles's name was mentioned, she paused. "Mr. Dawson?" "He called in sick the morning Ellie disappeared. I remember clearly. That day he showed up late, carrying his own tool bag. I asked if he needed the drug cabinet locked, and he said, 'No, I'm just taking some ether to disinfect.' I thought he was joking." She introduced herself as Margaret Flynn, nurse in OR2. Her voice was even, but her eyes held unease. Kemp asked a few short questions. She answered concisely. Only what she was certain of: Charles often stayed late after shifts, sometimes working alone in the drug storage, not letting anyone in. Once, she saw him take a small ether vial, tuck it into his white coat pocket, and say he needed it to wipe a stain at home. "Did you tell anyone about that?" Kemp asked. Margaret glanced down the hallway, lowering her voice. "No. Who would dare suspect him? Mr. Dawson was trusted by the doctors." "But," she hesitated, "he had a way of looking at you that made you afraid, like he knew something you shouldn't know." Kemp thanked her and left, carrying a thicker stack of notes than before. Outside, the sun poured down on the parking lot, reflecting off the hood of the Ford he had borrowed from the station. He paused for a long time, looking toward the road leading back to Birch Hollow. In his mind was the image of Charles washing the car at 3 in the morning, and 2 bottles of ether vanishing without a trace from the hospital storeroom, right in the week his wife disappeared. That evening, Kemp returned to the station, turned on the desk lamp, and spread out the photocopy of the inventory ledger in front of him. Charles Dawson's signature sat between the entries: 6/14, 2 bottles ether, and 6/15, morphine sulfate, 10 ampules. At the bottom edge, Halford had signed off. A small but undeniable detail: that signature was time-stamped, 5:20 p.m., June 14th, meaning Charles had withdrawn the drugs just hours before Ellie was last seen. Kemp looked at the small photo of Ellie in the file, a bright face, a tired but kind smile of a dedicated nurse. Next to it was a photo of her hands, taken for her employee ID, a faint callus on one finger from wearing gloves too much. He placed the 2 photos next to Charles's signature, a chill running down his spine. A man bringing home anesthetics in the middle of the night, a woman vanishing without a trace, a car smelling of ether and river mud. Those 3 pieces now fit closer than ever. But Kemp knew, as long as there was no body, it all remained suspicion. When he turned off the light and looked out through the fogged window, the lights of Hannibal Hospital on the hill still blazed in the darkness. There, among hundreds of anonymous bottles, 2 bottles of ether and a box of morphine had disappeared, and perhaps, with them, a life. In the last days of July 1955, Hannibal shifted into the sweltering heat of midsummer. Eleanor Dawson's disappearance had become the topic everyone in town whispered about whenever they met at the grocery store or church. But after more than 6 weeks, everything remained at a standstill. No body, no witnesses, no confession. Only scattered clues left: a bottle of ether tossed in the yard, a faint bloodstain on the garage floor, 2 bottles of drugs missing from the hospital storeroom, all like an unfinished puzzle without the centerpiece. Sheriff Harold Kemp still clung to what little he had. He had his men scour the riverbank area again, even hiring a civilian search team with tracking dogs from St. Louis. For 4 straight days, they combed the old dock area, shining lights through dense reed beds, dragging iron hooks through the cold river mud. They found a few small items: a rubber glove, a scrap of rough cloth, shards of broken glass, but nothing with clear indicators. The police sent them for analysis, results all negative or unidentifiable. The Mississippi kept flowing, slow and indifferent, carrying everything downstream. Meanwhile, Charles Dawson continued going to work regularly. He dressed neatly, entering the hospital as if nothing had happened. When summoned for further questioning, he always maintained the same tone: calm, polite, neither angry nor afraid. He agreed to a second house search, provided hair and blood samples, even led police around the marsh area Kemp suspected. But when asked to take a polygraph test, Charles just smiled faintly. "I don't believe machines can measure conscience." That remark kept Kemp awake all night. He knew Charles's type: confident, guarded, accustomed to controlling everything, and he understood that without a body, the prosecutor couldn't keep the case open forever. In August, the search team was pulled back, the file starting to gather dust in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. In the memo sent to the county court, Kemp's final line read, "Missing person case, probable foul play, insufficient evidence." Autumn arrived, golden leaves covering Birch Hollow Road. The Dawson house remained silent, windows shuttered all day, a for sale sign staked in the yard. One October morning, the local realtor called to inform Kemp that the house had sold to a couple from Illinois, cash payment. Charles Dawson moved out in just 2 days, leaving no trace, not a letter, not Ellie's personal belongings, not even the wedding photo that had hung in the living room. He told neighbors he was moving to Kansas to start over. No one in town saw him off. After that, the case drifted into silence. The local paper stopped running stories. Those who had gossip moved on to other topics. Only Sheriff Kemp occasionally drove by the house at the end of the street, now repainted, with flowers added to the yard, but in his eyes, it still held the same cold yellow light from the night Ellie vanished. In January 1956, the official case file was transferred to the Jefferson County Archives. Inside the cardboard box labeled Dawson, Eleanor M. missing were all that remained: the drained Parker Davis ether bottle, the glass syringe, a few blurry crime scene photos, the blood-stained fabric scrap, a photocopy of the drug inventory ledger, and statements from the hospital. Those exhibits were carefully sealed and placed on the 3rd shelf, among dozens of other unsolved files. When Kemp signed his name for the last time on the final page of the file, he paused with the pen for a long moment. On the desk, Ellie's ID photo lay amid the papers, a kind smile, bright eyes, a face unaware that the man who took the photo with her would be the last to see her alive. He gently folded the file shut and placed it in the box. "Until something new comes up," he said quietly, to read. "It'll rest here." And so it did. For nearly half a century, that box lay still in the dimness of the damp Jefferson County storage room, waiting for technology, memory, and justice to find their way back to each other. Nearly half a century later, in the fall of 2004, the record storage room of the Missouri State Police Department in Jefferson City still held its characteristic musty smell of old paper and rusting metal. Thousands of files stacked high to the ceiling, bearing names of the disappeared, cases without endings. Detective Laura Pritchard, newly transferred to the cold case unit, spent her first weeks combing through the archives catalog. She was younger than most colleagues, sharp, meticulous, with a habit of reading every line of reports like tracing an untold story. That afternoon, as the last light filtered through the narrow small window, she paused at a low wooden shelf labeled with a faded tape. 1950, 1959. Unresolved. A dark paper box nestled in the corner, handwritten ink on the lid. Dawson, Eleanor, missing. 1955. The script slanted evenly, with a slight tremor, likely from Sheriff Harold Kemp, back then. Laura lifted the box down, brushed off the thick dust, and opened it. Inside, everything was still intact. An old Park Davis ether bottle, cloudy glass, sealed with a frayed-edged brown paper tag, a 10-inch glass syringe, needle tip lightly rusted, 3 black and white photos of the kitchen garage and Ford car, a stack of faded notes, topped with inventory records, Hannibal Regional Hospital. Laura skimmed the first few lines and immediately stopped, the last name in the drug sign-out table, Charles Dawson. She sat silent for a few minutes, feeling like she was touching a voice from the past. A 1955 disappearance, husband, an anesthetist, 2 bottles of ether, and a box of morphine missing from the storeroom. All the pieces familiar, because she had read similar cases in training files on medical crimes. An anesthesia murder and disposal, she thought to herself. But in 1955, they had no DNA, nothing to prove it. Laura carried the case box to her desk, spreading everything out carefully. The fluorescent light shone down on the cold metal table, making the items appear as if just stepped out of an old photograph. The ether bottle still bore faint fingerprint smudges, and inside seemed to remain a bit of yellowish liquid. She knew that with current techniques, even a small amount was enough to analyze for biological traces. The next morning, Laura brought all the exhibits to the Missouri State Forensics Lab. She presented them to the examiner, requesting modern DNA and fingerprint testing. "This is a 1955 file," she said. "I need to know if we can extract any biological traces from these items." The technician looked at the ether bottle, smiling faintly. "If the seal is intact and the storage environment dry, we have a shot. No one's tested 50-year-old samples in this state yet, but we'll try." 3 days later, Laura returned. The evidence box still sat in the secure vault, but now with an added new file, preliminary forensic analysis. The first line made her heart race: DNA residue detected on syringe barrel, female origin, mitochondrial trace. And the next line, latent fingerprints on glass bottle, partial match, male, likely subject Charles Dawson, hospital employment card, 1950. She read those 2 sentences over and over. 2 exhibits, 2 traces surviving half a century. One was the husband's fingerprint, one was female DNA, possibly Ellie's. If true, this was the first direct evidence linking victim and suspect. That evening, in the cold case unit office, Laura presented the findings to the unit chief and the Jefferson County prosecutor. On the conference table, the ether bottle and syringe lay in new plastic bags, gleaming under the light. "We have fingerprints, DNA, drug records, proving Charles Dawson withdrew ether and morphine the night his wife disappeared," she said. Her voice controlled but clear. "It's no longer a missing person. This is a murder." The air in the room hung heavy as lead. Finally, the prosecutor spoke. "I want this file officially reopened, and I want to find that man, if he's still alive." Laura nodded, closing the documents. On the cover was the name she had read dozens of times that day: Eleanor Dawson, missing 1955, reopened 2004. Outside, the first autumn rain began falling on Jefferson City. The drops drummed steadily on the tin roof, mingling with the wind like the breath of an old case waking after nearly half a century of sleep. The forensics report returned a week later, turned Detective Laura Pritchard's ordinary morning into a moment she knew she would never forget. The DNA analysis lab in Jefferson City called directly, "Pritchard, you'll want to read this one yourself." She arrived that morning, walking the long hallway flooded with white lights. In the cold air, The hum of scanners and familiar ethanol smell created a feeling both strange and sacred, where time, even half a century past, still left traces. At the table, the lead technician carefully turned the report pages. "This is the result from the glass syringe," he said, voice even. "We extracted an incomplete mitochondrial sequence, but enough for comparison." "Comparison sample?" Laura asked. "Eleanor Dawson's niece. She lives in Springfield, Missouri, agreed to provide a hair sample last week. Result, complete maternal line match." Laura fell silent. She looked at the enlarged photo of the old syringe, cloudy glass, time-worn streaks on the surface. And there, at the barrel neck, the biological trace that had clung for 50 years. Eleanor's DNA. She was still there, on the very tool that had stolen her breath. The technician turned another page. "We also recovered fingerprints on the ether bottle. Faint, but 3 characteristic points matched Charles Dawson's professional file, archived at Hannibal Hospital in 1950. 3 points? Enough for legal identification. We cross-referenced with old data. The whorls and ridges on the right thumb match perfectly." Laura needed no further explanation. In her mind, everything began fitting together. The medicine bottle, the anesthetist husband, the wife vanished without trace, and now, his fingerprints still imprinted on the evidence. For half a century, Charles Dawson might have changed names, left Missouri, built a new life, but that handprint remained, waiting to be seen. She sat there through the morning, reading the appendix closely. Chemical analysis, soil samples. The report detailed how the forensics team extracted soil remnants from the old evidence bags and compared them to archived soil samples from Hannibal Regional Hospital in 1955. The chemical structure and ether compounds in the soil matched perfectly, pure medical ether produced by Park Davis, used only in Midwestern healthcare systems at the time. Reading that, Laura exhaled softly. This was no longer a chain of coincidences. This was a causal thread, linking from the hospital to the house on Birch Hollow Street, from Charles Dawson's hands to Eleanor's death. That afternoon, she carried the nearly 200-page report to the Jefferson County Prosecutor's office. The small workspace, window overlooking the Missouri River, walls hung with photos of solved cases. Prosecutor Thomas Gerber, 30 years on the job, listened without a word. Laura presented concisely, "We have Charles Dawson's fingerprints on the ether bottle, Eleanor's DNA on the glass syringe, soil samples containing ether matching the batch imported to the hospital where Dawson worked, and per the inventory, 2 bottles of ether and a box of morphine went missing the week she disappeared." Gerber rested his chin on his hand. "So we have a chain of evidence, but no body." "Right. But we have a perpetrator who used medical skills to cover his actions. No body doesn't mean no murder." The prosecutor opened his notebook, flipping back to old lines on the missing person, 1955 case. Under Harold Kemp's signature, he added a line in red pen, "Reclassified homicide investigation. Active." That evening, Laura returned alone to the evidence vault. She opened the plastic bag, holding the ether bottle, peering through the cloudy glass at the old liquid still shimmering in the light. She thought of what Harold Kemp had written in his final file entry. "For now, it will rest here." And now, after half a century, she was the one reopening that sleep. Outside the window, Jefferson City sank into autumn fog. Laura folded the report, tucking it into the red case file. The last line on the first page, read in bold font, "Material link between suspect and victim confirmed." She read it silently once, then stored the file next to a Missouri map. From her view, the Missouri River flowed into the Mississippi, passing through Hannibal, where this story began. She knew that tomorrow, the case would be officially reinvestigated, and the name Eleanor Dawson would be spoken again, not as a missing wife, but as a victim finally heard. Laura turned off the light, closing the door. Outside, streetlights cast yellow down on the water, shimmering like a streak of memory just revived. In the darkness, on the evidence shelf, the ether bottle and syringe lay still, but now, they were no longer inert objects. They had become living testimony from the past, something time could not erase. Charles Dawson, or rather, the name he used afterward, Charles Delmont, had vanished from Missouri in 1956. As if swept off the map by the wind. For nearly half a century, no one knew where he lived, what he did, or even if he still existed. But then, in late 2004, when the Eleanor Dawson case file was officially reopened, Detective Laura Pritchard and the federal task force began reconstructing the trail of a man thought buried in oblivion. From National Archives data, Laura started with the smallest detail, the signature of Charles in the Hannibal hospital file. That script, slanting slightly right, with an unusually deep downstroke on the D. When she sent that sample to the FBI's handwriting analysis unit in Quantico, she received a response in under a week. There is a medical practice file in Kansas 1961, registered under Charles Delmont, signature matches 96%. Laura looked at the photocopy of the file, a photo of a man in his 40s, short-cropped hair, wearing a white blouse. Under the photo, occupation clearly stated, certified nurse anesthetist. A perfect timeline. He left Missouri in 1956, appeared in Kansas in 1961, and continued his old profession, just with a name change. She sent verification requests to the Kansas State Medical Board and the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists, ANA. The results returned sent a chill through the entire task force. Charles Delmont was one of the most renowned anesthetists in Wichita throughout the 1970s, 1980s. He opened a small private clinic in a quiet North City neighborhood, beloved by patients, respected by colleagues. Medical records showed he practiced until 1990, then retired. No priors, no disputes. A model husband, an exemplary citizen, and possibly a murderer. Laura sent the fingerprint sample from the ether bottle to the FBI, requesting a match against Charles Delmont's medical records. The result came back 2 days later, in just 3 short words, fingerprint match confirmed, 100% identical. No more doubt. Charles Delmont was Charles Dawson. The husband who made Eleanor disappear in 1955 now lived peacefully in Kansas, hiding among those who believed he was a good man. When the news came in, the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office immediately coordinated with the FBI for a federal arrest warrant on homicide, interstate evasion charges. But since the case was over half a century old, every step had to be cautious. They needed evidence not just to arrest, but to prosecute in court. If he gets wind, Prosecutor Gerber said, he'll have time and money to vanish again. We have to do this quiet. And so began the covert surveillance phase. Laura and federal agent Ryan Nichols drove over 6 hours from Missouri to Kansas. Arriving in Wichita on a frigid February morning, they parked a block away from the ivory white house at 2107 North Juniper Street. The address matching Charles Delmont's practice file. The small house had neatly trimmed grass, freshly painted wooden fence, a 1987 Buick parked in the driveway. Through binoculars, Laura saw a man in his 70s, posture still straight, wearing a gray cardigan, stepping out to water the plants. Silver hair, but the face still carried the hardness from the old file photo. His hands trembled slightly, but movements remained precise, deliberate. Every morning, he watered the yard, then drove a few blocks to a small clinic with a weathered sign. Delmont, Anesthesia Services, Consultation and Training. That private practice sat in a 3-story red brick building behind a community hospital. Laura and Nichols watched for days, filming him coming and going, talking with young trainees, occasionally lunching at a diner 2 streets away. No unusual actions, no signs of guilt, but for Laura, just watching how he washed his hands, thoroughly, slowly, with surgical technique, she knew he had never forgotten the habits of an anesthetist, and never forgotten the night in 1955. One afternoon, they watched him step into the private storeroom behind the office. The door locked tight. A small sign hung outside, authorized personnel only. Through the door crack, Laura glimpsed the glass shelves inside, filled with glass vials, some of them labeled with old Park Davis brands. She snapped a photo, her heart racing. He still keeps the habit of collecting drugs. He might still hold evidence. That evening, she sent all the photos and reports back to Missouri. After reading them, Prosecutor Gerber said succinctly, "Enough. Prepare the warrant." On March 12, 2005, the federal arrest warrant was signed and stamped urgent. Laura was assigned to coordinate with the FBI Wichita field office to execute the arrest. She knew that after nearly 50 years, the man who once thought he had buried his past was about to face it. In the darkness of the motel room, Laura looked at Eleanor's old photo once more. The gentle face, eyes straight into the lens, half smile, as if still waiting for an answer. She said softly, almost whispering, "Tomorrow, Eleanor, we'll bring him back." Outside the window, Kansas wind blew through the bare maple trees, carrying a biting chill. And that night, under the dim yellow lights of Wichita City, a manhunt was about to begin. The manhunt that justice had waited half a century for. 2 days after receiving the federal arrest warrant, Detective Laura Pritchard still wasn't entirely at ease. All the forensic evidence was solid, but she knew to get the case through prosecution, they needed a human voice. A witness who could recount, with memory and emotion, what the physical evidence couldn't say. And that name appeared in Harold Kemp's old file, on page 47, the last line in blue ink. Interview pending. Margaret Flynn, nurse, Hannibal Regional. When checking administrative records, Laura discovered that Margaret Flynn, the OR2 nurse from 1955, now lived in Kansas City, just a few hours' drive from Wichita. She was 77 years old. The next morning, Laura set out. Interstate 70 stretched through early spring fog, flanked by barren fields. She pulled up to a small nursing home on a hill, faded sign, Maple Haven Residence. A young nurse led her to the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. Margaret Flynn sat by the window, snow-white hair, thin frame but eyes still unusually bright. When Laura introduced herself, she just nodded. No surprise. "You're here about Eleanor Dawson," she said, voice raspy. "I've been waiting for this to happen for a long time." Laura placed the recorder on the table, starting slowly. "Did you work with Charles Dawson?" Margaret smiled faintly, a tired smile. "Worked, and more than that, I was foolish, you know. In 1955, I was 40, divorced, lonely. He was courteous, confident, made me believe I was the only one who understood him." She paused, looking out the window where Kansas sky was blanketed in thick clouds. "But he didn't love anyone. To him, people were just experiments. I knew that on the night Ellie disappeared." Laura sat still, not interrupting. "It was the night of June 14th, Margaret continued. "I was home, getting ready for bed when the phone rang. It was around 11:30. I recognized his voice right away." She inhaled softly. He said, "Just 3 sentences. She's asleep. It's done." Then hung up. The room was so silent that Laura could hear the clock ticking. "Are you sure?" he said. "She's asleep? She's sleeping?" "Yes." I asked who, but he had already hung up. I knew Ellie was home. They had just argued. And the next morning, when the news of her disappearance spread, I knew right away what had happened. Laura bent her head to jot quickly in her notebook, hand slightly trembling. "Did you tell the police about this at the time?" "I did, to Kemp. But he couldn't do anything. No body, no evidence, no one would believe a single divorced nurse who had an affair with a reputable man. I stayed silent for half my life." She reached out, lightly grasping Laura's wrist. "You know, he withdrew 2 bottles of ether and a box of morphine that evening. I was the one who co-signed the inventory because he said he needed them for tomorrow morning's surgery. I remember clearly because he left after his shift, carrying his own tool bag, and never returned them." Those words nearly made Laura hold her breath. 2 bottles of ether missing, the 11:30 call, and the cold statement, "She's asleep. It's done." "Mrs. Margaret," Laura said softly, "if we present this testimony in court, are you willing to confirm it?" She nodded, her eyes suddenly brightening as if a burden had been lifted. I've lived my whole life with guilt. When I saw the news that he was practicing in Kansas, I knew he was still alive, still at peace. But Ellie wasn't. It's time, I spoke out. Laura turned off the recorder, stood to thank her. As she reached the door, Margaret called after her, "Do you know what makes me never forget that night?" "What is it?" His voice, so calm. No panic, no tremor. Just like someone who had just completed an unpleasant task that had to be done. I heard the relief in that voice, and I knew she would never wake up again. When leaving Maple Haven, light rain fell in Kansas. Laura pulled over, opened her notebook, looked at the lines she had just written. 11:30 p.m. She's asleep. It's done. Witness Margaret Flynn. In that moment, she felt all the pieces had closed together. Margaret's testimony not only confirmed Charles's actions, but also connected all the evidence. 2 bottles of ether, hospital records, fingerprints, DNA. Now they had sufficient legal grounds to execute the arrest warrant. She folded the notebook, started the car, watched the rain through the windshield. On the way back to Wichita, Laura thought of Eleanor Dawson, the woman who had been silent for 50 years, and she knew that this time, other women, Laura and Margaret, would speak the truth for her. Early morning on March 24, 2005, Wichita was still shrouded in thick fog. The quiet streets of North Juniper were almost silent except for the hum of a garbage truck. Inside the gray van parked less than 2 houses from 2107, Detective Laura Pritchard sat among FBI Wichita agents and Kansas police. In her hand was the federal arrest warrant, signed and stamped the night before, the paper that justice had waited 50 years to have read aloud. In her earpiece, the command agent's voice came succinctly. "Target inside, lights off, move in on my mark." Outside, it was still quiet. Through binoculars, Laura saw the silver-haired man step onto the porch. He wore an old gray sweater, holding a coffee mug, stepped slow but steady. It was Charles Dawson, the man all of Missouri thought had died half a century ago, now living under the name Charles Delmont. "Go," the order came. 4 men crossed the lawn, surrounding the front door. A loud knock echoed. "Federal agents, open the door." No response. 1 second, 2 seconds, then the door swung open. Charles stood there, not surprised, not asking why. He just looked at them, eyes icy cold, steam rising from the coffee mug in his hand. "Charles Dawson," Agent Nichols read aloud. "You are under arrest on a federal warrant, charge of second-degree murder in connection with the death of Eleanor Dawson, Hannibal, Missouri, 1955. Charles set the mug on the table, raising his hand slowly. "I don't know who she is," he said softly, voice deep and hoarse. They cuffed him, reading his Miranda rights. Laura glimpsed in those eyes not fear, but weariness mixed with a touch of disdain, as if this was just a belated annoyance to him. While Charles was led outside, the technicians entered the house. The living room was tidy, faint smell of disinfectant. On the wall hung a series of medical commendations, all in the name Charles Delmont, CRNA. The private storeroom behind the office, where Laura had once peeked through the crack, was now wide open. Inside was a large glass cabinet, filled with drug vials and medical instruments. An agent pointed. "Got this." On the desk amid the papers was a brown leather-bound notebook, edges frayed. When opened, the early pages were notes on anesthetics, chemical formulas, clinical records, but in the middle pages, the familiar slanted handwriting scrawled, "Ether plus morphine. Perfect induction." Smooth, silent. Laura stood frozen looking at that line. Everything she had read in the 1955 file, Harold Kemp's speculations, Ellie's evidence, all now lay in that trembling handwriting. Half a century of evasion, and Charles had unwittingly left the formula of his crime in his professional notebook. As he was led to the car, neighbors began peeking out. Some whispered, some stood stunned, disbelieving. To them, Mr. Delmont was the kind neighbor, the doctor who had helped so many over the years. Laura heard someone murmur, "It can't be. He saves people." But in her mind, only Margaret Flynn's words echoed, "He doesn't love anyone. To him, people are just experiments." That noon, at the FBI Wichita office, Charles Dawson sat in the interrogation room, hands on the steel table, fluorescent light casting on his aged face. Before him were Laura and Agent Nichols. They reread the charges, giving him a chance to speak. For 6 full hours, he was completely silent. No looking, no responding, no requesting a lawyer, just sitting straight, eyes fixed on the one-way mirror. Laura changed tactics, placing Eleanor's old photo in front of him, the 1954 hospital employee photo, bright eyes and kind smile. For a moment, she saw his gaze flicker, as if an old memory had flashed by. She said softly, "She never left Hannibal. You know that. We have DNA, fingerprints, witnesses. Speak, Mr. Dawson. Let her rest in peace." 6 hours of silence, only the clock ticking seconds. Finally, Charles turned his head, looking straight at Laura. His eyes were cloudy, but still held something cold as steel, and he said, voice hoarse, almost a whisper, "You'll never find her. Nothing more." He turned away, letting them lead him out. That afternoon, the escort convoy of 2 Kansas police cars and 1 federal vehicle took him across the state line toward Missouri. Along the way, heavy rain poured, water pounding the windows. Laura sat in the back seat, watching the old man silent, cuffed hands on his lap, a man who had lived his life as someone who saved others but ultimately carried the secret of the death he created. When the car passed the "Welcome to Missouri" sign, Laura closed her eyes. Half a century ago, Eleanor Dawson had left Hannibal in silence. Now the one who made her disappear was on his way back there, not to live, but to answer for what he thought no one could ever find out. 2 days after extradition to Missouri, Charles Dawson, or Charles Delmont as everyone had known him, sat in the interrogation room of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. He still wore the gray prison jumpsuit, unusually neat, collar crisp, hair combed back, like someone about to enter the operating room rather than a criminal awaiting trial. For 2 days, he said nothing but requests for black coffee and the morning paper. But that morning, something had changed. Perhaps the weariness of old age, or the realization that his game of evasion had finally ended. Detective Laura Pritchard entered the room with Prosecutor Thomas Gerber. White light cast down on the cold metal table. She placed the small recorder in front of Charles, pressed the button, voice steady. March 26, 2005, interrogation of subject Charles Dawson, regarding the 1955 disappearance of Eleanor Dawson. "Do you agree to answer voluntarily?" Charles raised his head, eyes dull, then nodded faintly. "I'm tired," he said slowly. "I just want to tell it right." Laura exchanged a quick glance with Gerber, then asked, "Do you want a lawyer present?" Charles smiled faintly. "I've talked enough with lawyers for half a lifetime. This time, let me talk to you." He leaned back in the chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment, as if searching memory, then began. "I didn't intend to kill her. I just wanted to teach her a lesson." "What lesson?" Laura asked. "She always threatened to leave me. She thought she was strong, thought I needed her. I just wanted her to understand. She controlled nothing." The room sank into silence. Only the recorder's faint whir. "I gave her a small dose of ether," he continued. Voice low and even, no remorse, no fear. Just enough to sleep, not to die. I've done it hundreds of times in the operating room. But she struggled, fell, and hit her head. When I checked her pulse, it was fading. I knew I'd gone too far. Gerber gripped his pen tightly. Laura kept her voice calm. "What did you do after that?" Charles looked straight at her, cloudy eyes glinting like a knife edge. "I did the only thing I could. I cleaned up, washed everything with ether, then took her to the car. I drove south of Hannibal to the riverbank marsh where I used to fish. That night the fog was thick. No one saw anything." He paused, taking a long breath, lightly tapping his fingers on the table. "There was a fallen willow about 300 yards from the old levee road, near the year-round stagnant water. I buried her there, about 4 feet deep. I still remember the smell of mud and ether mixing. Laura asked softly. Are you sure you could still recognize the place? Charles smirked, a thin and inscrutable smile. She's still where I left her. That statement made the room noticeably colder. Laura felt her throat dry, but continued asking, why didn't you flee the state? Why live in Kansas? Practice as if nothing happened. Because I succeeded, he replied, voice light as breath. No one found her. I thought, if the world forgets, then it never happened. I just changed my name, continued doing what I was best at, anesthetizing. I saved hundreds of people, you know. I atoned in my own way. Laura didn't respond. She knew men like him always convinced themselves they controlled everything, even life and death. Gerber stood, signaling the technician to record the marsh location he described. A map was spread out. Laura pushed it toward Charles. Show us exactly where. Charles took the pen, drawing a winding line from the river road down to the dark area near Bay Creek. He circled a small spot. Here, he said. The fallen willow is still there. If no one's cut it down, she's right under it. Laura looked down at the trembling but eerily precise pen strokes. That map, along with the confession, would be the ticket taking him back to where it all began. When they turned off the recorder, Charles leaned back in the chair, sighing. Now, do you believe? Believe what? Laura asked. That sometimes people just need a really deep sleep to never have to wake up. She looked at him for a long time, then turned away. That afternoon, Prosecutor Gerber filed for an emergency exhumation warrant for the Hannibal riverbank marsh. A forensics task force was dispatched that night, carrying the map Charles had marked. Laura stood in the hallway, looking through the foggy glass at Charles in his cell. He sat with arms crossed, eyes half closed, like someone who had just completed a surgery. Perhaps in his mind, everything still lay under that cold river mud, where he thought time would bury it along with Eleanor. But this time, he was wrong. Outside, Missouri River wind rose, carrying damp rain. And somewhere near Hannibal, under the ancient fallen willow he had mentioned, the secrets he believed would never be found were about to surface from the ground. Early morning on March 27, 2005, thick dew blanketed the dirt road leading to the south, Hannibal Marsh. Wind from the Mississippi blew cold and heavy with mud scent. The Missouri State Forensics team set up barriers around the area, marked with yellow tape fluttering in the wind. At the center of the cordon, right where the ground dipped among leaning old willows, Detective Laura Pritchard stood silent. In her hand was the old map Charles Dawson had marked with trembling blue pen 2 days ago. 300 yards from the levee road, the lead technician read again. Beside the fallen willow root, near the year-round stagnant water. Just as he said, a massive willow trunk lay tilted, roots digging into dark mud. Stagnant water pooled, ground soft and cold, thick moss covering the branches. When the exhumation team began digging, the shovels hitting earth sounded soft, heavy, like the earth's breath. They worked slowly, meticulously layer by layer. After more than an hour, the technician called out, "Something here." Everyone stopped. Laura bent down. Under the black mud, a white-gray object emerged, the even curve of a human forearm bone. She felt her heart tighten. The forensics team continued expanding the area, digging a few more inches, then other bone fragments appeared. Ribs, vertebrae, pelvis, and finally the skull, tilted to the left, jaw still intact. Beside the skull, the flashlight beam reflected off something glistening. A technician gently picked it up, a thin but exquisite silver bracelet, tarnished. On the inside surface, the deeply engraved letters were still legible. E.D. Laura clenched her fists. She had seen this bracelet in Ellie's old wedding photo, the gift Charles gave his wife in their first year of marriage, which she always wore on her left wrist. A few minutes later, at the edge of the pit, another object was discovered, a shard of broken glass syringe, the needle tip snapped off, and still caked in mud. Small, almost meaningless, if not tied to the story Charles had told. The anesthetist husband, hiding the body in the mud, cleaning up with the very tools he once used to save lives. The entire area fell silent, only the drip of water from the willow roots. Laura watched the scene, unable to look away. Half a century had passed, and now Eleanor Dawson had finally been found, not in rumors, not as a lost file, but as the stark truth before her eyes. The skeleton was exhumed throughout the afternoon. The forensic experts worked slowly, gathering each bone fragment into stainless steel trays, numbering them sequentially, photographing every detail. They placed the silver bracelet and the broken syringe separately in evidence bags. When the final tray was lifted from the ground, a strong gust of wind swept through, rustling the willow branches overhead. The whispering sound felt like the breath of the woman herself, finally given back her voice. That night, the forensic transport vehicle carried the remains to the Jefferson County Medical Examiner's lab. Laura followed behind, the vehicle's lights casting long beams on the wet road, the trembling glow piercing the fog. In her mind still echoed Charles's final words. "She's still where I left her." He had been right, but now she wasn't there anymore. 2 days later, the official examination results were sent. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the femur bone matched Ellie's niece's sample perfectly, an unmistakable result. Beside it, the chemical analysis noted high residues of ether and morphine in the bone marrow, ratios consistent with medical anesthesia doses. Conclusion: the victim had been exposed to both substances immediately before death. When she read that line, Laura gently closed her eyes. In her mind appeared the image of Ellie, the young woman, smiling in her white nurse's uniform, standing outside Hannibal Hospital. A gentle, dedicated person, taken by the one she trusted most. That afternoon, the vehicle carrying the remains returned to Jefferson County. Police and prosecutors waited in the back lot of the morgue, under light rain. When the forensic technician pulled back the white sheet covering the bone tray, no one spoke. Only Laura stepped forward, placing her hand on the tray lid, saying softly, "Welcome home, Eleanor." Beside the tray was the small evidence bag, in which the silver bracelet engraved ED gleamed faintly under the yellow light. It had lain in the mud for 50 years, yet the engraving remained intact. Perhaps, like human memory, buried for how long, it never truly vanished, only waiting for someone to dig it up again. As night fell, the lights in the examination room stayed on. Laura stood by the window, looking out at the rain-swept parking lot, the red ambulance lights reflecting in long streaks. In her heart was a feeling both painful and relieving. The case now had a body, a victim, irrefutable evidence. No longer just a name lying dormant in a dusty file. Tomorrow everything would start anew. The new indictment, the upcoming trial, and Charles Dawson would have to hear to the end the story he thought he had buried. But tonight, at least Eleanor Dawson had returned to the world, to her own name. And this time, no one could make her disappear again. The Missouri State Forensics Lab blazed with white lights. On the table, dozens of photos were spread out. Bones, silver bracelet, syringe, fingerprints, map, every piece of a story spanning 50 years. Detective Laura Pritchard and the investigation team sat around the metal table. They were preparing to reconstruct the entire Eleanor Dawson case for the first time, not based on conjecture, but on science and truth. The forensic specialist began presenting in a slow, almost ceremonial voice. The timeline begins on the evening of June 14, 1955, at the house at 42 Birch Hollow, Hannibal. Based on suspect Charles Dawson's statement and the physical evidence recovered, the sequence is as follows. Around 10 p.m., after an argument, Eleanor was anesthetized with medical ether. Bone residue concentrations indicate direct respiratory exposure for a short time, meaning forced inhalation, not voluntary. He opened a photo illustrating a simulation of the Dawson kitchen. On the table was the half-finished coffee cup, the floor where the bloodstain was found, and the Park Davis cap under the table, all matching Harold Kemp's 1955 report. When the victim lost consciousness, the specialist continued. Charles injected morphine sulfate to maintain deep sedation and prevent convulsions. Estimated dose equivalent to 10 milligrams based on marrow residues. That's a respiratory depression dose in an adult. On the screen, a 3D simulation image came up. The reconstruction scene per the description, a young woman sitting at the kitchen table, hand still on the coffee cup, the man approaching from behind, one hand holding an ether-soaked cloth, the other gripping her neck. The radio music fading, she struggles, the chair topples, then everything goes limp. Laura clenched her fists watching the simulation image. Even knowing it was just a reenactment, she still felt a chill down her spine. The next scene was the Ford car. Night shadows outside the garage, Charles bending down to drag something heavy wrapped in bedsheets, opening the rear door, placing it on the seat, the sound of concrete scraping against the tires. The forensic specialist continued. River mud and ether residues under the car match the soil samples from the body discovery site. This confirms the Ford was the transport vehicle for the body. After leaving the house, the suspect drove along the Old River Road to the marsh, 5 miles south of Hannibal. There he dug a hole and buried the victim, along with the syringe, found at the same depth. On the electronic board, each forensic chain was connected by red arrows. DNA, syringe matches victim, fingerprint, ether bottle, matches Charles Dawson. Chemical evidence, soil containing ether and morphine. Confession, detailed burial location statement. Body recovery, remains, silver bracelet engraved ED, broken syringe. 5 elements matched perfectly, like 5 links in a closed chain. No gaps, no doubts. One of the older specialists said quietly, almost concluding, Kemp was right. He wrote in the 1956 file that it was possible the husband used medical drugs to stage a perfect disappearance. Half a century later, science proved it. Laura stood up, looking around the room. In the cold light, all the 1955 evidence now lay neatly in new sealed plastic bags, like witnesses just awakened. She knew the case was now ready to leave the lab for the courtroom. That afternoon, the entire investigation results were transferred to the Jefferson County Grand Jury. Prosecutor Thomas Gerber presented each part, from Nurse Margaret Flynn's testimony, to DNA data, fingerprints, and the exhumation map. When the screen showed the engraving inside the silver bracelet, several jurors bowed their heads slightly. No one spoke when Gerber concluded, "We didn't just find evidence, we found a person, Eleanor Dawson, who had her voice taken in 1955. Today, we return that voice." The 12 grand jury members voted, the result was unanimous. The indictment was officially approved, second-degree murder. The trial was scheduled for August 17, 2005, at the Jefferson County Court. Charles Dawson, 79 years old, would appear in court, not as Wichita's Dr. Delmont, but as the man who killed his wife and lived a lifetime in deception. That evening, Laura left the office late at night. The Missouri sky was blanketed in thick clouds, faint moonlight reflecting on the river surface. She stopped the car by the bridge, watching the water flow lazily. Where 50 years ago, nothing had been found. Now that same river illuminated the truth. In the silence, she recalled the black and white wedding photo, Ellie in a simple white dress, Charles beside her, half smile. A photo that seemed like love, but was actually the opening moment of tragedy. And now, that very photo would be placed on the evidence table, in a Missouri courtroom, as a reminder that nothing, however buried for half a century, can escape the light of justice. On August 17, 2005, nearly 50 years after Eleanor Ellie Dawson vanished from Hannibal, Missouri, the trial of Charles Dawson opened in Jefferson County. The morning sky was overcast, gray clouds blanketing everything, wind from the river bringing damp chill. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered thickly, everyone wanting to witness the moment when the case buried for half a century finally had its answer. Inside the courtroom, light streamed down onto the dark oak wood of the judge's bench, jury box, and spectator seats. The air was so heavy it was possible to hear the rustle of paper. Charles Dawson sat at the defense table in a gray suit, silver-white hair, face dry and expressionless. Beside him was his court-appointed defense attorney. Opposite was prosecutor Thomas Gerber. Behind him, Detective Laura Pritchard, the one who had revived the case from the ashes of the past. Judge Harold Benton, with his raspy and stern voice, declared the trial open at 9 a.m., his every word echoed through the room. "We are here today to try Charles Dawson on the charge of second-degree murder." Not another sound besides the scratch of pens and the soft breathing of spectators. Prosecutor Gerber stood, hand on the thick file. He spoke slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case was buried for 50 years. But time cannot erase the traces of truth. Science has done what people in 1955 could not, given voice back to a woman whose life was taken." He began presenting each piece of evidence, mitochondrial DNA extracted from the victim's bones, matching Eleanor's niece perfectly. Fingerprints on the Park Davis ether bottle, matching Charles Dawson's professional file at Hannibal Hospital exactly. Ether and morphine residues in the exhumation soil, matching the 1955 medical drug batch. And finally, the recorded confession from the defendant himself. When Charles's voice echoed from the speaker, hoarse, even, and cold, the room fell utterly silent. "I didn't intend to kill her. I just wanted to teach her a lesson. I buried her in the marsh. She's still where I left her." The words hung in the air, faded, then dropped into absolute silence. Gerber signaled a court officer to bring out the glass case. Inside was the silver bracelet found with the body. Inside, engraved with LED light from the window, made it gleam faintly. He said softly, "This is not just evidence, it is that woman's heart. The husband she trusted used his very professional tools to make her silent forever." When he placed the case on the table before the jury, Charles bowed his head, eyes down, hands clenched. No one knew if it was remorse or fear. Defense attorney Mark Alton stepped to the podium, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a 79-year-old man who has lived his life serving medicine. This case relies on aged evidence, a confession coerced in a state of weakened health. An elderly man interrogated for hours, without a lawyer. Is that a voluntary confession? As for the evidence, remember, it was stored for half a century. How can we ensure it wasn't contaminated, wasn't mixed? Justice cannot rest on the rot of time." Those words caused murmurs in the spectator seats, but only for a moment. Prosecutor Gerber countered by calling 2 FBI Quantico forensic experts as witnesses. They detailed the original 1955 evidence sealing process, proving it had never been opened in 50 years. One technician stated firmly, "Fingerprints don't degrade with time. They either belong to someone, or they don't. And here, we have a perfect match to Charles Dawson." Next, a DNA expert explained how they extracted mitochondrial samples from the bones and compared to the maternal line, affirming the results' independent authenticity. After the presentation, the jury box was silent. The defense's argument seemed as fragile as fog on a window pane. By mid-afternoon, the prosecution called Detective Laura Pritchard as a witness. She recounted the journey of reopening the case, from the dusty archives where she found the old box, to touching the glass syringe, sending it for DNA testing, tracing the trail to Wichita, and hearing Charles admit the crime himself. Her voice was calm, but choked when mentioning the night of the body exhumation. "We didn't just find bones, we found justice. What haunts me is how he said it. No remorse at all, just smugness." When she left the stand, Charles watched her. Their eyes met for a moment, and Laura understood. He knew the game was over. That evening, Judge Benton gave final instructions to the jury. "You have before you evidence, testimony, and conscience. Your task is not to punish, but to determine truth. At 4:15 p.m., the jury retired to deliberate. The air in the courtroom thickened. Laura sat in the back row, gripping her keychain tightly, eyes fixed on the wall clock. Time dragged suffocatingly. As dusk faded outside the windows, the room light turned pale yellow. People still sat still, no one speaking. 6 hours later, at 10:22 p.m., the deliberation room door opened. The 12 jurors entered, faces grave, eyes heavy. Judge Benton asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, voice clear and firm. "Yes, Your Honor, we find the defendant, Charles Dawson, guilty of second-degree murder." The room held its breath for a second. Then murmurs, choked sobs erupted everywhere. Laura closed her eyes, breathed deeply, felt her tears fall. Not for victory, but because after half a century, Eleanor Dawson had finally been called by her right name. Victim, not missing person. Charles sat still, no reaction, no words. When the bailiffs approached to cuff him, he only bowed his head very low. That aged face suddenly seemed unusually small. Laura watched as he was led out the back door. Courtroom lights cast his shadow long on the floor, slow, heavy. Outside, cold Missouri wind swept through the trees. Laura stepped onto the portico, looking up at the night sky. Thin clouds parted, revealing a single star twinkling in the east, small, faint, but still shining. She whispered, as if to herself, "That light, it's yours, Ellie." And in the quiet night of Jefferson County, justice finally spoke. The next morning, August 18, 2005, Jefferson County was lightly fogged. The courthouse was still crowded, though the verdict had been set the night before. Everyone wanted to hear the final sentencing, the end punctuation for a case spanning nearly half a century. In courtroom 3, everything remained as yesterday, the old wood smell, golden light filtering from high windows, and in the center, Charles Dawson, the silver-haired man, grayish face, sitting straight, eyes staring into space. Judge Harold Benton entered, black robe rustling lightly. His voice rang out, raspy and firm. "The Jefferson County jury, after considering all evidence, has found the defendant Charles Dawson guilty, second-degree murder. Today, the court pronounces sentence." Prosecutor Thomas Gerber and Detective Laura Pritchard stood. Gerber spoke briefly, voice deep and restrained. "Your Honor, this case not only reclaims justice for a forgotten woman, but stands as proof that crime, no matter how long buried, will surface." He said no more, just bowed his head slightly. The judge looked to the defendant. "Mr. Dawson, do you wish to say anything before sentencing?" Charles raised his head, cloudy eyes, expressionless. He sat silent for seconds, then spoke slowly. "I have nothing to say. She's gone too far now." Murmurs spread through the room, some gasping. Laura looked at him, clearly hearing in that voice no remorse, only the coldness of someone who once believed he had the right to decide life. Judge Benton banged the gavel once, dry and sharp, his voice resolute. "Based on the jury's verdict, given the crime's severity and the time evading justice, the court sentences life imprisonment, no parole. Defendant Charles Dawson will be incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary, Jefferson City." The second gavel bang echoed decisively, like ending a long chapter in Hannibal's history. In the spectator seats, some clapped softly, some wiped tears. Laura stood still, eyes not leaving the defendant. She thought of Eleanor, the young wife in 1955, the smile in the wedding photo, the silver bracelet engraved ED, and the years buried under river mud. Finally, after half a century, she had seen the one who made her vanish led away in handcuffs. 2 deputies escorted Charles to his feet. As he walked out, the chains clinked softly on the tile floor. He looked at no one, didn't turn back. The back door closed, leaving a heavy void in the courtroom. That afternoon, Missouri newspapers ran front-page headlines, "Cold case solved. After 50 years, husband convicted in 1955 murder." A photo of Charles Dawson bowing his head at sentencing appeared across all broadcasts. Some local papers wrote, The Eleanor Dawson case, a symbol of justice's unyielding effort. Hannibal residents, after half a century living with the mystery, could now name what had haunted them too long. That same day, the case file was transferred to the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office. Laura personally signed the final log, case closed, verified conviction. Then she placed the silver bracelet engraved, ED, into the evidence box. Resealed it, labeled, returned to evidence vault. The faint silver gleam in the late day light made her pause for a long moment. She recalled the old diary lines Ellie had written in the file, "I just want peace to see change in him." Those words now stood witness to the opposite, the silence of a man who never knew how to love. As she left the courthouse, Missouri's sky turned to light rain. Laura stood under the portico, looking toward the river, the water still flowing lazily as in 1955. But in its depths, the secrets had been unearthed. Across the bank, the marsh where Ellie's body was found was cordoned with temporary fencing, sign posted "Forensic Site Closed." The willow bushes still leaned in the wind, drooping as if bowing to the woman finally at rest. 1 week later, the sentence was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary. Charles Dawson did not file an appeal. When his defense attorney asked why, he simply replied, "I've lived too long." It was said that in his first days of incarceration, he spoke to no one, only sitting and rereading his old medical notebooks until they were confiscated. In the small cell, the man who had once been one of America's top anesthetists was left alone with his past, the one thing no drug could numb. In Jefferson County, the Eleanor Dawson case file was permanently closed. Inside the storage box were the exhibits that had spoken for the dead. The glass syringe, the ether bottle, the silver bracelet, the black and white wedding photo. On the file cover, Laura personally wrote the final line in blue ink. "Justice delivered, August 18, 2005. When she turned off the light and closed the file room door, the last yellow glow faded on the old paper cover. Outside, rain fell steadily on the roof tiles. 50 years earlier, a man had washed his car in the middle of the night to erase his crime. 50 years later, rainwater washed away the dust of silence again, letting the truth emerge. And this time, it would never be buried again. In October 2005, 2 months after Charles Dawson's sentence was pronounced, the Missouri State Cold Case Unit officially released a comprehensive technical report on the Eleanor Dawson case. The report, over 200 pages thick, not only summarized the investigation journey, but was also regarded as a historical milestone in modern forensics applied to ancient files, where science, memory, and perseverance had converged to revive justice forgotten for half a century. At the press conference in Jefferson City, Detective Laura Pritchard stood beside Prosecutor Thomas Gerber as the Cold Case Unit Director presented the forensic process step by step. Behind them, on the projection screen, familiar images appeared: the Park Davis ether bottle, the glass syringe, the silver bracelet, and the black and white photo of Ellie in her 1954 nurse's uniform. Below each image were detailed captions on the techniques used, methods never before applied to evidence as old as this. The first step was DNA recovery from 50-year-old evidence. The forensics lab technicians used mitochondrial DNA (mtDNA) extraction, a novel process at the time, to retrieve genetic material from long decomposed cells. The DNA sample was taken from the sticky residue still clinging to the syringe, then amplified using polymerase chain reaction, PCR. The result matched the hair sample from Eleanor's niece with an absolute maternal line match. This was seen as a breakthrough, proving that biological traces could survive longer than people imagined. The second step was recovering latent fingerprints from the ether bottle. Using cyanoacrylate vapor technique, the forensics team created a small vapor chamber, exposing the glass surface to the adhesive fumes. Under UV light, the ridges emerged clearly, matching Charles Dawson's 1950 medical professional file exactly. Previously, ancient cases often deemed glass evidence useless because smooth surfaces degraded easily, but this result completely changed that view. The third step, soil residue mapping, analyzing soil remnants in stored evidence. The chemistry lab compared organic composition, ether evaporation ratios, and clay particle structure from the old soil samples with those taken from the marsh where the body was exhumed. The results matched to the point of reconstructing the Ford car's route that night, from the Dawson house on Birch Hollow down to the Hannibal riverbank where the mud contained unusually high ether concentrations. The soil, as Laura said at the press conference, became time's most faithful witness. The final part of the investigation process was dedicated to the human element, interviewing elderly witnesses. Specifically, Nurse Margaret Flynn, who that year had heard the fateful 11:30 p.m. call with the words, "She's asleep. It's done." The cold case unit emphasized the importance of verifying human memory alongside scientific evidence. Without Margaret's account, Gerber said, justice might still be trapped in test tubes. The report also documented the process of recovering old Hannibal Hospital administrative files, drug inventory ledgers, and physical evidence sealed intact. The proper preservation, albeit unintentional, had given later investigators the chance to revisit the case with modern technology. At the end of the conference, the Missouri FBI director announced that the entire Eleanor Dawson case file would be incorporated into training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, under the Historic Forensics module. This was the first time a state-level case was included in teaching as a model for cold case reconstruction. On the presentation slide, large and clear text appeared, "Justice doesn't expire. Evidence remembers." Laura sat in the front row, quietly watching the images she had lived through now become lessons for the next generation. She recalled the musty smell of the file storage, the first time she touched the old ether bottle, and the morning when the first sunlight hit the burial pit by the willow root. All of it still fresh in memory, only now they no longer belonged to obsession, but to proof of faith in science, in the endurance of people seeking truth. The report ended with a short, bolded sentence. The Eleanor Dawson case, proof that justice can come late, but never loses its way. And in the dim afternoon light of Jefferson City, Laura knew that story, once written in facts, would outlive any human. In November 2005, Hannibal, the small town on the Mississippi River, once again became the focus of national media, but this time not for a crime, but for a memorial ceremony. 50 years after the night Eleanor Ellie Dawson vanished, Hannibal residents gathered in the ancient St. John Church, where her family had held their 1949 wedding. Late afternoon light flooded through the stained glass windows, shining down on the wooden pews where generations sat in silence, those who had known her, those who had only heard of her, and even those born when the case had already sunk into oblivion. On the altar, Ellie's black and white photo was placed between two tall white candles. Below it was a bronze plaque engraved, "In memory of Eleanor Dawson, 1924, 1955. She is home." The elderly priest began the service with a short prayer, his voice deep and slow. "We are here to remember a woman whose voice was taken, but who has finally been heard. She is no longer just a name in a missing persons file, but a symbol of faith that truth can sleep but never dies." Organ music rose, somber yet gentle. In the front row, Detective Laura Pritchard sat beside Prosecutor Thomas Gerber. Both were silent, only bowing their heads as eulogies for Eleanor were read. The service ended with everyone approaching one by one to place a white chrysanthemum by the portrait. When Laura drew near, she placed the silver bracelet engraved ED on the altar, the one she had kept throughout the investigation. The silver caught the light, faint in the candle glow. She said softly, just loud enough for herself, "We found you." A few weeks later, Hannibal Regional Hospital, where both Eleanor and Charles had worked, held a separate ceremony to dedicate a memorial plaque in the hospital grounds near the old anesthesia room. The granite plaque was engraved, "In remembrance of Eleanor Dawson, nurse and healer, whose life reminds us that compassion must never be silenced." Young nurses stood around, many quietly crying as they heard that it was right here, in 1955, that 2 bottles of ether and a box of morphine had vanished, setting the tragedy in motion. A head nurse said at the ceremony, "We do work to save lives, but Ellie is a reminder that trust must also be protected. She is part of this place's history." The story of the case spread across America. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a headline, "The 50-Year Silence." Other papers quoted the opening line from the Cold Case Unit report, "Justice doesn't expire. Evidence remembers." People called the Dawson case one of the most successfully solved cold cases of the century, not just for the investigators' persistence, but because it carried the pain and redemption of an entire community. On TV shows, Hannibal residents were invited to share memories. Mrs. Mildred Hartley, the neighbor who had heard the door slam that night, now nearly 90, spoke slowly on screen. "I once thought Hannibal would never escape the shadow of that disappearance. But now, I feel relieved. She's come home." Those words brought tears to many. But alongside the sense of peace, there was a heavy aftertaste. People began discussing crimes buried for half a century and the prolonged silence. Some wondered how many other cases had been forgotten, simply due to lack of technology, lack of perseverance, or lack of people willing to look back at the past. At the local high school, history teachers dedicated an entire class to the Dawson case as an example of how science can restore justice. A student asked, "Why wasn't he caught sooner?" And the teacher only replied, "Because some crimes know how to wait until people are ready to face them." In Jefferson County, the Dawson case file was temporarily displayed in the historic forensics exhibit, alongside other ancient cases. Visitors stood looking at the syringe, the ether bottle, the silver bracelet, all behind gleaming glass. A small plaque below noted, "Recovered 2004, solved 2005, justice after 50 years. Beside it was a photo of Laura and the cold case unit team, faces etched with fatigue, but eyes bright with conviction. Many months later, Laura still often returned to Hannibal. Each time, she stopped at the riverbank, where wind blew through the fallen willows. The marsh was now dry, fenced off and newly grassed. She looked down at the still water and recalled Charles's words in the interrogation room. "She's still where I left her." This time, Laura smiled faintly, whispering, "No, he was wrong. She's not there anymore." As night fell, the bells of St. John Church rang out, echoing long over the river. In Hannibal, people no longer called it the Eleanor Dawson disappearance. They called it by another name, the 50-Year Silence. A silence broken by the light of science, by the perseverance of those who believe that justice, even if late, is still justice. The memorial plaque in the hospital grounds was now a stopping point for young nurses. Below the engraved words, someone had left a small piece of paper written in pencil. She vanished in 1955. Science and truth found her in 2005. Missouri finally let her rest. The afternoon wind carried the paper lightly, touching the cold stone face, then stopping amid the white chrysanthemums. And there, after half a century, Hannibal was finally at peace, as if Eleanor's spirit itself was smiling in the Mississippi River breeze. The story of Eleanor Dawson is not just an old case solved. It is a mirror reflecting today's American life on how we identify risks, preserve evidence, and speak up in time. In 1955, a husband with access to ether and morphine taught his wife a lesson, then erased traces by scrubbing the Ford in the dead of night. Half a century later, it was those small details, the river mud streaks under the chassis, the Park Davis cap under the kitchen table, the glass syringe with mitochondrial DNA residue, the fingerprints recovered via cyanoacrylate vapor, that spoke for the dead. A practical lesson for today: if you see signs of domestic violence or control, prolonged arguments, isolation, needing air then sudden silence, don't normalize it. Report to police early and seek victim services support. For healthcare facilities and schools, the story reminds us to tighten control on anesthetics, painkillers, and inventory audits. like the ledger showing 2 bottles of ether and 1 box of morphine, missing the night. Ellie vanished. For communities, do as the Hannibal neighbor did, notice the unusual 3 a.m. car washing, note the time, preserve the scene. For law enforcement, invest in cold case units, store evidence to standard, because science advances today, it's mtDNA and soil residue mapping. Tomorrow, it'll be even better. And for each of us, honor victims' memory. A silver bracelet engraved ED placed at the St. John Memorial reminds that justice may come late, but it takes persistent people to safeguard the truth. If you believe justice, even if late, deserves to be heard, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing the journey of uncovering forgotten cases. Thank you for following the story of the 50-year silence. See you in the next episode, where another American mystery will be unveiled.